Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Louis Bachaud. He's a PhD student at the University of Kent and also the University of Lille. His research investigates the history and sociology of science, and he's been particularly interested in contemporary misunderstandings of evolutionary sciences and their appropriations in online debates around sex and gender. And so today we're going to focus a lot on how people from the manosphere misuse research in the evolutionary sciences, evolutionary psychology particularly, but also other sciences like that. So, Louis, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
So, before we get into some of the claims that people from the manosphere make about women, about seduction, about gender roles, and all of that, could you start by telling us what the manosphere is? I mean, how would you define it?
Yeah. So fortunately, even though there are disagreements about the different groups that go in there, there's quite a bit of consensus about what the manosphere is. The harder thing is what you put inside of it, but it's basically a loose collection of men's groups on the internet, and they tend to try to cater to men from a male perspective and to tell them about contemporary issues in society, mostly Western society, once again from a masculine point of view. And so then from then on, you have different subgroups that focus on different themes and that have different agendas and different goals and methods. But basically, online men's groups that try to talk as men to other men about, the lives of men in current society.
Yeah. And so inside the manosphere, you have groups like, for example, people related to MRAs, men's rights activists, pickup artists, MGTOW, or men going their own way, the red pill and black pill communities, and also some incels, right?
Yeah, so I use this typology with five groups. You can find, many different ones. The internet
Yeah.
goes very quickly. Movements um, spawn new hybrids of each other. They evolve all the
Yeah.
time. But basically, big five, I would say, you have the men's rights activists. So they are the oldest group in the manosphere. They predate the internet. So you
Mhm.
can say they predate the manosphere too. And they are kind of the opposites of feminism for men in
Yeah.
the sense that they want to have reforms and cultural change on some issues that are linked to men. So, for example, a big one is divorce laws or custody battles in court after a divorce. Well, you are going to find fathers' rights groups who try to defend divorced fathers' interests.
Mhm.
And so they do tend to be opposed to feminists around issues of, domestic violence, divorce, where, both sides basically take the sides of men or women. You then have pickup artists. They're the other older one. So they are your dating seduction coaches. So maybe less ideological because more commercial. They try to
Mhm.
sell you a service, but still they've been there from the beginning and they've influenced the language and the ideas of the manosphere quite a bit. And then in more recent years, you've had upsurge in new, maybe more radical communities, more misogynistic communities. So the three that are specifically online, because the first two I told you about, they existed before the internet.
Mhm.
You had dating coaches, you had men's rights activists, but the new three from the 2000s, 2010s would be the red pill,
Mhm.
which is kind of a combination of the pickup artistry, the game. So that's how they call seduction techniques. And you have more, right-wing politics in there, anti-PC culture, anti-progressivism, and also just a whole life philosophy of how to be a successful, independent alpha male, etc., etc. So that would be the red pill. MGTOW share a lot with the red pill. So MGTOW means men going their own way,
Yeah.
but they say society is too hostile to men right now, so we should just live on our own. So they are separatists and they advocate primarily against any form of, serious relationship or commitment, romantic or sexual with a woman. And the most infamous one these days, the best known one are, I think, undoubtedly incels because they have committed a few terror attacks in the past decade. And these are um, you know, young men mostly who are virgins and who are who have an entire identity based upon this sexlessness and, you know, this frustration, anger, and bitterness at not being able to find a relationship.
Mhm. And so you told us there about some of the differences between these groups, but are there general beliefs that you find across all these groups, or are they very different or diverse ideologically?
Yeah, so that was one of the I think challenges of trying to study the manosphere is trying to find the common themes running through them, trying to identify what makes them a manosphere, because
Yeah.
otherwise, why would we be using this term if they have nothing in common?
Hmm.
And I think for sure, what you find is that there's the overall discourse that there is some sort of male crisis or malaise in Western society. So they will focus on different angles, different aspects of it. So incels will talk about maybe all the males except the best looking ones, and they will focus on relationships and sex. Men's rights activists will focus on false rape allegations and reproductive rights for men. So they have different focuses, but they kind of all operate in this assumption that men have a tough time in current society. There might even be some sort of male crisis. That feminism hasn't been doing anything to try to combat this, or on the other hand, has been promoting and furthering this by just either they will think it has gone too far in defending women's rights and interests, or it was always some sort of anti-male political lobby or something like that. So I think that's one of the trope that's common to all these groups. And then they also share a lot of jargon, language, you know, terms that are specific to the manosphere that
Yeah.
circulate between those communities, and some sense of community as well. You know, people go there and they share their experiences in a fraternal environment. So you might think manosphere and think about the violence and the misogyny that's directed towards others, which is definitely a feature. But no, if you go to those spaces, you will also see brotherhood between guys, you know, that
Yeah.
open up and talk about their relationships, their emotions, etc., etc. So I would say that solidarity, the anti-feminism, and the idea of a male crisis, male malaise would be the big three things that run through all the groups.
Mhm. So I wanted to focus now a bit on female sexuality and claims that these different groups make about this topic. But before we get into the claims specifically, let me just ask you, when it comes to female sexuality, what would you think are the most important things for people to know about it when they get across this kind of information on the internet from the manosphere?
So I would think that what you find on the internet, on the
Hmm.
manosphere,
Yeah.
can be quite remote from what you will find in actual scientific papers. So
Hmm.
sometimes it's explicitly drawn from a paper, but you have the memes, you have the tropes, you have the
Yeah.
exaggerations, all these layers, and the politics, frankly. The fact that, you know, if someone fits your preconceived idea, it will be exaggerated.
Yeah.
So my main advice for someone would just be to, and that's an advice in general, of course, go to the original source. There are some sources like science media or podcasts like yours that I'm sure are or textbooks that are good sources, secondary sources that you can trust and believe that they made a good job in trying to honestly transcribe what was in the original research. As comes to the manosphere, this can be the case. If you go to the Incel Wikipedia, they have a big wiki page on testosterone, which is very well documented and lots of footnotes, and they love science. That's been one of the findings of my research. But sometimes it's a commercially incentivized type of platform that tries to sell, you know, courses and seminars to men. Sometimes it's just a guy who doesn't seem to understand the basic principles very well. So I would say, as a rule, if you know that the source comes from the manosphere, you just better go check the research itself and look for yourself. Is the sex difference that big? What did the researchers find? Does it allow you to make this very broad generalization about the sexes and things like that? You know?
Yeah. But this is very interesting because even looking at it from a historical perspective, I guess that we could say, and you will tell me more about that, we could say that some early evolutionary accounts of female sexuality insisted on some of the points that people from the manosphere also bring to the table, like women being coy and having monogamous tendencies and stuff like that, right?
So since Darwin's time in evolutionary biology and the idea of sexual selection, um, Darwin had this big thought that it's mostly the males who kind of parade and fight, and they try to catch the female's
Yeah.
attention, and then the females choose. So it was called female choice, and it's still thought to be a huge, driving factor in evolution, explaining the antlers of deer or the plumage of the birds of paradise, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But interestingly, Darwin was so steeped in the cultural mindset of his time that he thought that seems to be true in all the animals except for humans. So he said, in humans, it seems to be the women who dress up with these frills and laces and who parade in front of the men, and it's actually the men who select. So even then, you can see that there was politics, that he didn't really maybe apply what he was seeing to his own species on this little area. So that was your traditional model, and that worked quite well, right? We know that
Mhm.
males have more reproductive variance in mammals because, insemination costs them, from 5 seconds to 20, 30 minutes, I don't know, whereas females have to go through the gestation process. And so it did mean that there was selective pressure, increased selective pressure on young males to, fight and grow bigger and reproduce quick and early. So that's how you explain sexual dimorphism. And that mostly stood in evolutionary biology until the 1970s. And then, some primatologists in particular started noticing that this just didn't fit what we were observing.
Mhm.
Females seem to be sometimes aggressive, manipulative, deceitful, horny. And then what we just realized is that they were, of course, also selected to selective pressures, and they were also players in the games of sexual selection. Sure, males might be fighting, and there tends to be this bias in biology where you notice the males more because they're louder, because they're brighter, because they fight more, they're more rowdy. And so we kind of tended to overlook all the
Mhm.
ways in which females also competed for reproduction. And even though there's less variance and they have less to win, quote unquote, in terms of fitness
Mhm.
in the Darwinian game than males, because, a single man can sire 500 offspring, there's still huge variance. I mean, some females do not reproduce and some have three, five, six kids. So there was also selective pressure there. And since then, we have started investigating, all these aspects of female sexuality, all these potential fitness benefits that they can derive. And what's interesting is that I would say the impetus behind this was originally feminist. It was those female researchers saying, we have this male bias in our discipline. We look at female behavior quite less. We don't see females as competitive, as potentially promiscuous. We just are stuck in this Darwinian inherited framework where they are, coy and shy and choosy, etc., which
Mhm.
can hold for some species in some context, but they were
Yeah.
asking to complicate the picture. And what's funny is that this line of research on the female mating strategy has kind of complexified the picture of female nature. Right now,
Yeah.
you put competition, you put deceit, manipulation, gossip, aggression, coalitions. They are just, organisms like others. They are no, perfect beings. And but that was seen as feminist. Sex is good. Females can be promiscuous as well. There's nothing bad about it, and we have been biased in our biology. What's interesting is that today in the manosphere, the people love these theories. They love these hypotheses around female mating strategies. So I wouldn't say they're really echoing the old school 19th century Darwin style
Okay.
thing where they think that females are coy and choosy. On the other hand, I think they have an exacerbated view of how promiscuous and unfaithful women are based on these accounts of female sexuality that come from the evolutionary sciences and that were originally kind of feminist inspired.
Okay. No, that's very interesting. And yeah, actually, I should have rephrased my question and said that these early evolutionary accounts are the ones that uh, people from the manosphere would have liked to be true, because you hear many times from them that women should be monogamous, should stay faithful to their husbands or their boyfriends, but then when it comes to men, they can actually just screw around with how many women they can. It doesn't matter if they are married or if they're in a committed relationship. They can do that. They are allowed to do that, but the women, no, not really. Right.
So there is this insistence on what they will call body count, or trying to find a sexual partner who has
Yeah.
very little sexual experience or relationship experience, because they would think that it makes for just a better, more committed partner.
Mhm.
And they will find some research in, for example, sociology that show that the more partners you've had, the less likely it is that your marriage is gonna end up well, or that you're the more likely it is that you're going to divorce, etc.
Mhm.
So they do have this age-old sexual double standard for sure, where you have a lot of scrutiny on a woman's sexual history and you don't care much about a man's, for sure.
Yeah. And by the way, since earlier you were talking a little bit about what could be some of the benefits of short-term and extra pair mating for women, what are those benefits?
So I think it's first important to understand why we ask the question.
Mhm.
For males, there wasn't really ever that question about what could be the benefit for a male mammal of, being very horny all the time or trying to reproduce.
Yeah.
Because, they can just, in most species, I think 95% of mammal species, there are no real fathers, in the sense that fathers just reproduce and then they leave. If you've had cats and dogs, that's how it goes. So for most species, we really know what's going on with males, probably over evolutionary history. Anytime they could evolve in a way that's, made them likely to play this reproductive game and not pay any of the costs, and that they could just inseminate a female and then go away, that probably seems to have happened in most species. However, for females, there was always this idea that there was a huge limiting factor, right? It's the number of eggs, but it's also mainly the gestation, the
Mhm.
lactation. You have to take care of your offspring for maybe years before you can get another one. So then this was the puzzle. If that is the case, how come that when we study other female uh, mammals, especially primates, they seem to solicitate and enjoy also copulation that much? How
Mhm.
come they were wired by evolution to become so promiscuous, as you will find that term in the research literature, when the benefits are unclear? You can mate with 12 males, you're not going to have 12 times more offspring. So the researchers started to devise hypotheses. One of them that's been studied quite well in primates is paternity confusion. So if you sleep around with several males, none of them will be able to know that they are the fathers of your offspring, and
Mhm.
so they will maybe all directly help raise them, or
Yeah.
at least they will refrain from killing them. Because in a lot of primate societies, if a new male comes around and that he knows that the kids are not his, he's just going to murder them to kind of, replace them with his own offspring. Or at least that's
Mhm.
the evolutionary selective pressure there. I'm not sure that's what he thinks about consciously. I don't know what's in a primate's head, but
Yeah.
that's basically how this could have evolved. So, as a counter strategy against the infanticide by males, maybe sleeping around with several males could have allowed those, female primates to infuse the potential fathers. So
Mhm.
that's one of the potential benefits. So it's called paternity confusion hypothesis. You have mate switching hypotheses. So you are going to kind of sample other partners, other
Yeah.
mates, to kind of see if maybe it's worth switching or having at least cultivating some form of backup. Life is dangerous in nature.
Mhm.
If you have kids to raise, it can be nice to have backups. There's the resource-based hypothesis, where you might just be having sex with several males because you get several direct benefits from that, be it food, I don't know, shelter, protection, bodyguards, all types of things. And I don't think there's one hypothesis that could stand for all the female mammals, for example. The answer is probably that depending on the ecological conditions and depending on the particular, social structure of a species, you probably find infidelity, quote unquote, or multiple mating, extra pair mating, that's evolved in females in through many evolutionary paths because there are many potential benefits that were overlooked. We thought, oh yeah, a female just needs one partner. She doesn't need to enjoy sex. And, she'll just select the best father she can, and that's all she
Mhm.
does. One father, best seed, best genes, best parents, and then that's perfect for her offspring. Now that model still holds in many species, but it's more complicated. And I think we also found that through bird studies. So
Mhm.
birds are interesting to study these dynamics because they kind of resemble us in the sense that they are relatively monogamous in a lot of species, and you have the father and the mother building a nest and raising the young birds. So it kind of looks like a human family. And that's also because in birds, I think the males could not kind of like the mammals evolve to just inseminate females and leave because a bird just takes a lot of feeding to do.
Yeah.
Birds are very hungry for food because they fly all the time. Their metabolism is different. So
Yeah.
birds just spend their days eating and finding food. So they've evolved in that way. That means that they are ideal candidates to study monogamy. And then when we started doing DNA tracking, we also thought that there was much more sleeping around than we believed initially in birds, so they are kind of like us, partly monogamous, but we also have reams of evidence that in certain contexts, either the male or the female will go to another nest
Mhm.
and try to mate with other people. And we need to explain that because our sexual selection models historically were quite monogamous, finding a good mate for the female, here are the challenges she faces, and finding a good mate for a male, here is what he's looking for. But it's actually much more complex, and there are many individuals to choose from. And yeah, the picture has been complexified for sure.
Yeah, and another kind of topic that is also commonly brought up in the Manosphere podcasts and stuff like that has to do with some research on the female ovulatory cycle. So, first of all, what does the research actually say, and in what ways do people from the Manosphere tend to take from that research or misuse it or twist it, warp it? I mean, what are the kinds of claims that they make and shouldn't be derived directly from the research?
Yes. So one class of hypothesis about the evolution of female sexuality that I haven't mentioned is called the
Mm.
dual mating strategy hypothesis.
Yeah,
And so this means that uh, women, let's talk about humans, so I'm going to stop saying females. So
yeah,
women might have evolved drive for extra pair mating
yeah.
over evolutionary history if, for example, they could derive some benefits from short-term mating. So just having casual sex can provide you sometimes maybe good genes in terms of fitness. It can provide you all those class of benefits. And then you also have a long-term mate that you select for stability, providing resources, being a father. And then maybe those two things could have evolved concurrently so that women would be, kind of wired with drives that both make them monogamous, but in certain circumstances, they might have this interest for short-term mating. And so one of the predictions of that hypothesis was that around ovulation, when women are most fertile in the fertile phase of the cycle, you would have find maybe behavioral shifts. Because once again, over history, if you are having casual sex on the side just at the moment when you're fertile, it could mean that if you sleep with partners where you can you can see it's a complex type of hypothesis. It was kind of far-fetched, but some of it's interesting to discuss. But if you sleep basically with a muscular, tall, masculine man, someone who signals that he has good genes around
Mhm.
ovulation, then maybe you can, diversify the fathers of your offspring. Maybe you can have, strong sons and sexy sons, which was also part of this class of hypothesis. And so one of the predictions for that, and we started testing it, is do women's sexual behavior actually change around ovulation? And if it does, and if the dual mating hypothesis is true, it means that they should be looking for a more masculine partner.
Yeah.
They should be looking for, more casual sex just around ovulation. They should maybe behave in a more, flirty, alluring manner. And some initial studies found that. So studies found that, oh, some strippers receive more tips around ovulation. So maybe men can unconsciously perceive when a woman ovulates, and maybe women can signal it differently. There were diary studies where women were asked to say in their diary what day of the cycle they were in, and also, if they are having sexual fantasies about someone else than their partner, etc. And there were studies about face preferences. Do women actually want partners with more masculine faces and features around ovulation? And more or less, all of this has failed to replicate or has foundered when the studies are being conducted in more rigorous manners with bigger samples and all the good controls and conditions that you need to make good research. This research, which was mostly from the 2000s, has not really replicated well. So, for example, there was a study which found that women wore more revealing clothes when they were around ovulation. But then you look at the study, it was maybe 30 women. They excluded all those who were, not naturally cycling, who
Yeah.
were on the pill. They only took those who were in relationships, and they did not control for the weather. So they had them come at 2 points of the cycle, but maybe they were just dressed more lightly and loosely because the sun was shining better. And now in the 2020s, you have some, good teams of researchers from Germany who try to replicate the same effects, but they take hundreds of respondents, they control for all the good parameters, they pre-register the hypotheses, and we mostly failed to replicate most of the effects that were specifically linked to this ovulatory shifts hypothesis that was a corollary of the dual mating strategy hypothesis,
Mhm.
which meant that maybe women had those two different types of reproductive drives. And so one of the only thing we have that holds is that there's a general increase in sex drive around ovulation in women. That seems to be certain. However, we're not sure at all that it's directed towards some extra pair partners. Doesn't seem to necessarily imply they want to have more sex like on the side or with someone else when they're in a committed relationship. This means that whatever's happening with the hormones is just making them hornier around ovulation, which, from an evolutionary perspective, is not that hard to explain. But so that's the entire brand line of research that you were mentioning.
Mhm.
And why does it pleases people in the manosphere? Well, there's, this idea that they will take any research about female promiscuity. They will take any research about female infidelity. And since they have those negative opinions about it, since they're quite maybe conservative implicitly about, females' sexuality, they have those double standards that we mentioned. They are angry. This research is perfect for them. It can anger them. It can kind of convert some of their tropes that they have. So some tropes that you find are, even if you're in a relationship, she's always looking for something else. She's unfaithful. She wants more masculine, alpha or Chad type males. Well, if you have studies that show that she is having more fantasies, sexual fantasies, or wants more masculine faces around ovulation, that just fodder for your anger, if you will. Or if you think that, women are not to be trusted with, and when they go to the club, that with their, girlfriends, they are going to be unfaithful and try to seduce other men. And then you find a study that shows that, oh, strippers get more tips around ovulation, or women dress more loosely around ovulation. This just kind of fuels your entire narrative. But more than this, in the red pill, they have a saying which is exactly the mirror of this dual mating strategy hypothesis. And
Mhm.
they know it. So that's quite interesting to show that they are aware of those kind of intricate debates in evolutionary psychology that seems to be kind of abstract and really specialized. But you actually have communities of lay people on the internet that are aware of this and that say, oh, this is mate switching. No, this is dual mating. They're aware about these things. They just forget that these are hypotheses and that several of them can work together and all be true. and that this is all highly speculative at the moment, you know?
Mhm.
And so they have this saying in the red pill community that's alpha fucks, beta bucks. So which means that the alpha man gets to have sex, alpha fucks, and the beta man is the man who's just providing the resources. He's just the poor guy who's being, you know, exploited for his resources by an unscrupulous female sexual partner. And so when they see the dual mating strategy that basically says if women maybe have a drive or propension today for infidelity, it comes because of a legacy of this alpha bucks, beta bucks dynamic, where they would have one stable partner that they selected with one set of preferences, and then some casual sex partners that she could have selected through other preferences. And that obviously, you know, is perfect confirmation for them, but it's also, you know, perfect rage fuel, as the incels say, that is something that just makes you really angry.
Mhm. And so another thing that people from the Manosphere do, if I understand it correctly, is that they also cherry pick scientific information or cherry pick studies, right? Because, for example, just earlier you were mentioning how most studies that made those claims regarding the dual mating strategy, sexism hypothesis, and so on, were from the early 2000s. And then since then, people have tried to replicate them with better study designs, bigger samples, and stuff like that. And at least some of those claims do not hold much water, at least as far as we know now. But they are in the manosphere. They are still going back to those studies and claiming that that is all true, right?
To be fair, I would say that that's also something you can find in science. I mean, when someone is
Yeah.
committed to some hypothesis, they will kind of always dig up the same study, try to confirm their preferred hypothesis. And
Mhm.
I would say to some degree that's even part of the healthy game of science. You know, some people believe in a hypothesis to try to investigate it. Now, they should not hold on to it too long if the evidence, of course, fails to confirm their hypothesis. But I think part of what happens in the manosphere is that the cherry picking, I'm gonna describe it and answer you on this point, and then
Mhm.
afterwards we can come back to the implicit, I think, part of your question, which is what's their motives, what's their intent? Is it
Yeah,
that
that was another thing that I was
yeah?
going to ask you later.
So cherry picking, we can find evidence for sure, but as I said, in any literature review by a scholar, you're likely to find some things that they like a little more, some that they like a little less. But this is, of course, exacerbated when there are politics, and those groups don't necessarily. Their goal is not to accurately depict the world. You know, that's the goal of scientists, more or less, all of them. But you know, manosphere groups all have a different goal. You know,
Yeah.
recruit men, have you seduced women, or on the other hand trying to convince you to never have sex with women again. So of course what I would call the cherry picking is that depending on their agenda you will see that they focus on different areas of the evolutionary scientific literature. So the most obvious case is pickup artists and incels. They hate each other. They kind of try to attract the same demographic, you know, young sexless men who kind of roam the internet. And in the 2000s, those guys would have found pickup artist sites that would have told them, listen, here are my 10 tips to be successful with women. I'm going to explain you female psychology with evolution. And now in the 2020s, those same young guys, there's competition with the incel community that are going to tell them, listen, you're doomed. You were doomed from the start because of your genetics. She will only be interested in having sex with chads. And here's the science to back it up. So if you look at those two communities, they will all cite some sections, some parts of the literature, but it's obviously with very different focus because of their agenda. So you could call that cherry picking. For example, pickup artists are going to insist on female mating preferences for things that you can change or engineer. So they will say, confidence is sexy. You know, studies have shown that women want confident men. Or humor is very attractive. So you should be funny. You should be confident. So they will zoom in on the things that you can change.
Mhm.
Whereas incels, they will take other equally valid and they can interpret them correctly. There's not necessarily a conscious twisting of the results, but they will say, here is the results about the negative effects of being autistic in sex and dating. Being short, having a small penis, being bald, being this, that. So all things that you can very hardly, or if not at all, change.
Mhm.
So once again, some of them are commercial. They are trying to sell you hope. And so they say, here's this research, there's hope for you. And then this other group is trying to peddle hopelessness. And it says, look at this research, it's doomed, you know. What they all forget to do is, of course, give you precisely the statistics, the effect sizes in those studies. You know, it can both be true that humor is very important to get a sexual partner. Maybe it can have a correlation of, I don't know, 0.3 or 4 in a given, you know, date with in terms of, you know, trying to attract someone else that you're sitting across from. And then maybe your height, if you're short, will also have another very negative effect on potentially on average the attraction that this woman might feel for you. But there's no reason to kind of focus on only one or the other. You know, the goal of a good scientific model would be trying to know all these variables, all these predictors, their respective, you know, strengths, and then the context in which some of them are activated and some of which are not. And in the manosphere, so first off, scientists are very far from being there, you know. We are very far from having that level of predictive power in terms of something as social and complex as, you know, mate selection and sex and dating. And in the manosphere, they kind of focus in on one aspect or two, and they just become firebrands advocates for that, you know. Everything
Mhm.
that matters is face, everything that matters is height, everything that matters is looks. And you see that in incel communities quite a bit. They are always fighting, trying to hierarchize what trait is the worst, what trait gives you the less chances of succeeding at sex and relationship. And so they will kind of dig up those studies that are not mutually incompatible, but they by trying to hierarchize them to have a very simplistic vision of what's going on, they are going to unnecessarily kind of cherry pick basically, but it's not, you know, cherry picking so much as extreme exaggeration and simplification that has its roots in individuals and groups, trajectories, values, biases, agendas, etc., etc. So that's what I'm trying to unpick with my research, basically.
Great, but when it comes to their motivations, I mean, this is probably a two-part question, but I was interested in knowing if you have any ideas about what the motivations from both the people who produce this kind of content for the manosphere and then the ones who consume it, what the motivations there would be. Because, for example, when it comes to the ones that produce it, it could be, I guess, that in certain cases they have gone through some bad experiences in their relationships, and then that's why they start talking about that on the internet. Or perhaps sometimes they are just grifters. They know what they're saying is mostly BS, but they still say it because they know it sells and they know they can attract, I don't know, vulnerable, single, sexless men to their cause, let's say, or at least make them spend money on their products. And then, but when it comes to the ones who consume it, I would imagine that the vast majority of them would be, you mentioned at the beginning, virgins, and they would be also sexless men, and they would be also men who had bad relationships or just ended a relationship recently, so bad experiences. Do you have any idea about what the motivations behind
Okay,
those two
so
kinds of people are?
there are three things I want to say in order. First, you said maybe a majority are virgins. So that's just incels are just one
Oh, see,
subset of the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
manosphere,
yeah.
but
Right.
most groups will mostly be composed, some of them of middle-aged, you know, college-educated white men in
Okay.
their 40s or 50s who were married, have had divorces, things like that, that type of profile. So these people have had plenty of relationships in their lives. And you also have the pickup artists who have, you know, dozens, if not hundreds of partners because of what they do. You know, they spend their entire life trying to chase after women. So I don't even think your average manospherian's, you know, number of sex partner, I would have a hard time predicting if it's below or over average. So that's just one caveat. The
Mhm.
second one is that those people are quite hard to reach. So I've interviewed, for example, one of the main men's rights activist leader. He's called Warren Farrell. He's a very well-known activist. He's a public figure. But for those new, more obscure, more radical online-only communities, like incels and men going their own way, it's much harder to reach them out for interviews. They don't show their faces, they use pseudonyms. So if you can't ask someone about what drives them to do something, it becomes really, you know, unsteady ground to actually try to speculate on people's motives. And the data I'm mostly working with is discourse, what they produce. So forums, social media, videos, their ebooks, Discord, you name it. I've like scraped and studied a huge collection of materials that was generated spontaneously by those people. So one of the advantages is that they didn't ask one of my questions. I didn't get to orient the research process. I'm kind of seeing what they naturally did as a researcher. But of course, the flip side is that I can't ask them questions. So it's always hard to know about motives. I've also run a survey. I will be more than happy to tell you more about it, about their level of scientific education, how well they know evolutionary science, trying to measure certain biases and all that, and where they get their scientific content from. So I can also talk about this. As regards the motives, there are hundreds of thousands of people in the manosphere. It would be very hard to generalize on one type of motive. I think for the influencers and those people who produce the content, I'm sure you find grifters in especially dating, seduction type areas, like coaches who know that basically their students don't really stand a chance or that they're not going to change their lives, or that maybe this is a little bit overpriced for what they're selling. I'm sure you have people who are convinced they are doing good.
Yeah.
You have a lot of men who are come there because of, outrage at some inequalities in society, some things that they think that shouldn't be this way. Feminists should be talking about this. Why do men get drafted for military service in the United States in 2024 when the army is now, gender neutral? You have men and women serving in the army. Why would it only be men that get sent in the next, Korean War? So sometimes you have just men that go to these movements because of some initial outrage that's more political. But a lot of the time, what you see with the research is that it's kind of emotional, but it's hard to separate, of course, from the political. But it has to come from negative experiences in relationships. If you were cheated on, you're of course going to lend an ear to those groups that tell you about why women are naturally, have evolved to always look for a better partner, to switch mates, as we said, etc. If you have had a bad divorce and you lost the custody of your kids because this was contested in court, of course you're going to lend an ear to, those activists that tell you that current society is completely gynocentric, they call it, so that is favorable to women. And they might even have an evolutionary story to put on top of that. So yeah, variety of motives. I would think a big one that we should not overlook is the look for community, longing for community, especially with incels. If you've been bullied your entire life, there are, studies that show high prevalence of bullying with them. You're a virgin, so that's frustrating when everyone's, starting to discover sex and relationships. You've never been treated, decently by people, middle school and high school can be very tough, etc. And then you find this community of like-minded people. So that's for sure one of the big factors there as well, that sense of community, I would say. And as for the content producers, I'm trying to refrain from making judgments about, is he stupid? Is he a grifter? Does he just not understand the research? Does he consciously try to twist it? It's really hard to know.
But about that survey that you referred to there briefly, could you tell us more about it? What kind of
Yeah.
survey was it, and what were the results you got there?
So as I said, those people are quite suspicious. So if you come there and tell them, hey, I'm a researcher, I want to know about your politics, your life trajectory, your life events, they might, well, first they might fear you're the FBI or you're just a woke academic that wants to smear them. So I'm not asking a lot of very personal questions, but what I thought was I need a science quiz. I keep studying how those people use and understand science. And sure, it's very easy to reveal the flaws and the biases and to say, oh, look here, they've misinterpreted that study. Everyone can do that. But what do we know about their baseline level of understanding? How well did they know natural selection, the basic concepts in the life sciences? And so what I did is I designed a 20-item quiz, science
Okay.
quiz. So a little bit of stats, a little bit of hormones, genes, and then mostly evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. I took most of my questions from pre-existing questionnaires that had been validated undergraduate level, and then for comparison, I ran the same survey with a group of random US respondents to have a baseline. And so I managed to recruit 150 people from the Manosphere, from various subgroups. Those are very hard to reach. I would have hoped to have more. And
Mhm.
I have my 150 people, my US respondents, they took the exact same science quiz, and the results couldn't be clearer. The Manospherians, they have 15 out of 20 in terms of correct answers, and my average group has 10 out of 20. So obviously, people from the Manosphere, one of my main findings, you can't ascribe all of this to just misunderstanding the research. A lot of them, they understand evolution quite well. There's almost zero creationism in the Manosphere. They are, Darwinian enthusiasts. So this makes them a very unique part of the American right wing of the spectrum, where, Protestant fundamentalism is extremely strong politically in the Republican Party, and the Manosphere has been verging to the right, but still they believe in evolution. You have high levels of college education in terms of science. So a lot of them have had, science courses in college. And then I'm trying to dig things further by asking them about the sources of scientific content. Do you get your science from the Manosphere, or do you get it from Wikipedia, YouTube? Do you get it from textbooks, books? And the Manosphere doesn't come in super high in these lists. So those people, they are fond of, Robert Sapolsky's lectures, Richard Dawkins's books. I'm sure lots of them watch our podcast as well. There's a lot of content to be found on the internet with good, evolutionary scientific stuff. So once again, this complicates the picture quite a bit because um, they do understand the evolutionary, principles quite well. They do know what evolutionary psychology is. And then my job is just trying to go in the details and see what they get wrong, what they get right, what they
Yeah.
exaggerate, but what they also invent. Because one of the things that I found is that um, it's a unique phenomenon in which people in the manosphere actually devise their own hypotheses, their own evolutionary stories. And that's, I don't think, something that we had seen before. A community of lay people who appropriate a scientific discipline. They understand the way that you reason, because evolutionary psychology is a lot about this, adaptationist type of explanatory mindset, and they
Mhm.
apply it to the world around them, and that's fascinating. So I'm also studying those homemade or manosphere-made hypotheses.
Great. And by the way, since you mentioned there the fields that they draw their information from and misuse it, why do you think that evolutionary psychology specifically is so popular in the manosphere?
Okay, I think I have three answers to that.
Okay.
Because I've been thinking about this quite a lot. Why don't they appropriate sociology or psychology, mainstream psychology or anthropology? Well, what's going on with it? I think, firstly, they do come from a perspective where the sexes are quite different. They tend to view men and women as really different, and it gets reinforced by their ideology that makes them act in more, maybe masculine ways and expect women to behave in more feminine ways. And so
Mhm.
they kind of see the world around them like this. And that's one of the hallmarks of evolutionary psychology, right? It's one of the few scientific fields that really looks at the behavioral and psychological difference between men and women, that has a model to predict where those differences happen and where they don't happen. And so I think the sex difference stuff that you find in evolutionary psychology is inherently just much more aligned with their pre-established kind of folk wisdom or ideas or just the way that they lived in society. I think the people whom you end up finding in the manosphere, there's lower chance that those are people who've always found men and women to be quite similar, who have always hung around with, female friends and sisters and guys, and they kind of see humanity as a whole. Whereas, if you have this kind of sex differentiated perception of life plus ideology on top, then evolutionary psychology can give you perfect explanation for these issues.
Mhm.
I think the second reason why EP is so popular is the fact that those communities do tend to focus a lot on sex and relationships. And so, pickup artists, they are seduction coaches. They try to get you a girlfriend. Incels say, we don't have a girlfriend. MGTOW tell you, you should not have a girlfriend. So you see
Yeah.
that they are almost all around this nexus of, sex and gender and relationships and dating and seduction and all that. And once again, evolutionary psychology is a discipline of choice for that. Evolutionary psychologists do study a lot of sex and mating.
Mhm.
And I think the third reason is more political. Evolutionary psychology itself is very controversial, and it's been received very critically by feminists for the past 30 or 40 years
Yeah.
because it insisted so much on the sex differences, and the feminists had always been suspicious of these biological models of why men and women behave differently. And so since evolutionary psychology itself is kind of targeted by left-wing progressive movements or at least feminists in academia as some
Yeah.
sort of potentially hidden veiled male supremacist agenda type of discipline. Well, that's perfect if you're yourself an anti-feminist. There's kind of
Mhm.
this, oh, if the feminist hates that, then it must be something good. There must be something good about it. And I've seen that actually written in many Manosphere wikis and pages, like, oh, feminists hate evolutionary psychology. They love the idea that they love something that feminists hate. Even though if you actually look at the field of EP itself, those tend to be either, psychologists or anthropologists, heavily feminized, maybe more than 50% women, at least today, gets, graduate degrees in psych and anth. So lots of feminists in those fields as well. They tend to be more or less, liberal researchers living in urban cities. So they are not your male supremacists as you would imagine them. Evolutionary psychologists do not really fit this bill for the most part. But the fact that their discipline is controversial and hated by feminists, I think, is one of the biggest draws for the manosphere. And maybe if I had to have one last one, they
Yeah.
are just very gifted writers and popularizers for evolutionary science. I mean, Steven Pinker, Richard Dawkins, those are just top-notch science writers. They've reached wide, broad audiences. I don't know about your personal trajectory, but that's how I got into those disciplines in the first place. Some of those fantastic books by Pinker or Dawkins. You find great lectures on YouTube by Robert Sapolsky, who's
Yeah.
a hormone guy at Harvard. And so I think maybe another explanatory factor is that those disciplines, those fields have been very good at producing top-notch, enthusing, stimulating, scientific content as well.
Yeah, I mean, in my particular case, I started with Sapolsky and Pinker, and then went on from that. I think that those are probably the two most common people that people mention when they're talking about how they got into evolutionary psychology. But let me ask you perhaps about what could possibly be a fourth hypothesis to explain why evolutionary psychology is so popular among the manosphere. Could it be that evolutionary psychologists, the way they present information leads or contributes to those kinds of claims that we hear on the manosphere, or it could be the case that there are just a few bad apples in evolutionary psychology who promote those kinds of views. I mean, do you have
Yeah.
any thoughts on that?
So once again, we go back to motives, which are really hard to ascertain.
Yeah.
Um, Evolutionary psychologists, the big household names, they also tend to be writers. So they sell books. David Buss sells
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands of books, I'm sure. And
Yeah.
so they probably know that part of their market comes from those Manosphere Darwinian aficionados.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know what's the motive there. I don't even know what you can do about it. They try to write the best books they can, I'm sure. But you also find some instances where, evolutionary psychologists seem to have kind of tried to appeal to the same demographics as the manosphere. So most famously, David Buss opened a dating course A few years ago, it was called First Date Course, and he was saying, "Hey, I'm a scientist. I've worked at all these fancy places, and I'm the expert in the world in sex and mating. And if you pay the $1,000 for my course, I'm going to teach you much better than all those pickup artist guides." Jeffrey Miller in the 2000s, he had written a book that was the same, you know. So he's kind of criticizing pickup artists, but he's not criticizing them because mostly because they objectify women, because they are obsessed with just casual sex, because they just don't give men any sense of their own worth other than just, you know, trying to find someone to sleep with. But he was mostly saying their things don't really work, and here is the good science. And so they are evolutionary psychologists who use their expertise as sex, dating, seduction experts to try to sell commercial products because there are very strong incentives. There's a very big market. So in a way, they share part of this market with manosphere people. You know, they try to distance themselves from it, but they also try to appeal to the, you know, sexless young men, nerdy, sciencey demographic. Now, I
Yeah.
think it would be much better if they got their tips from, you know, a scientist with actual research that's much more nuanced than from the manosphere. But you could say that maybe some of those researchers, it's really hard to know if I can't interview them or what their motives are, what their views are. So, yeah, I'm not so sure that that's obviously been one of the big questions. And I do think that evolutionary psychologists have stressed sex differences a lot. You know, David Buss ran this very famous study on 37 cultures where you have men and women rate their preferences.
Yeah.
And since he was trying at the time in the late 80s and early 90s to promote EP, he really stressed on the finding that he found some stable cross-cultural sex differences about resources and looks. If you look at the results, there's so much similarity between men and women. You know, they want kind, they want honest, they want intelligent. And if you actually look at the percent of the variance that's explained by sex, it's just ridiculously low. I think it's in the single digits compared to the variance that can be explained by the different cultures that were surveyed. So
Yeah.
I think for sure, evolutionary psychologists in their fight against, you know, blank slate views, um, have kind of stressed a lot on heredity. They have stressed a lot on, you know, genes do matter, and you know there are different genetic and behavioral differences between the sexes. And in this ideological warfare, maybe they've been far. Maybe they've also neglected to say, let's not be too deterministic either. We can't explain much of this variance. There's a lot of cultural variation. There's lots of different patterns in behavior. And so I think one of the other reasons why EP gets appropriated and not behavioral ecology, for example,
Yeah.
I'm sure you've had behavioral ecologists in your podcast.
Yes.
They use the same Darwinian models. They mostly use the same methods these days. Maybe they do more ethnography, but it's very similar. But the behavioral ecologist looks at the variation, right? What resource or pathogens in a given environment makes humans behave and animals in a different way. Whereas the evolutionary psychologist, historically, he's trying to find the human universals, you know, the deep structure of the mind, the things that we all share in common, human nature. And so I think in that regard, also, we can say that evolutionary psychology in its project and communication is more liable to be appropriated by people who want to do very gross simplifications or generalizations about men, women, humans in general. You know, humans are this way. You know, they are a species with language. That's evolutionary psychology. You know, the language instinct by Pinker. Now, behavioral ecologists look more at the, you know, yeah, the variation, the differences between cultures. And so maybe that's also why it has been less appropriated than evolutionary psychology. And also it's less controversial. So maybe it's less alluring for those manosphere people.
Yeah, and you were talking about evolutionary psychology many times being focused on sex differences between men and women, but I think that possibly another issue here when it comes to how evolutionary psychologists talk about their own research is that they perhaps do not put enough emphasis on the fact that even among women and among men, there's variability. So,
For
I mean,
sure.
there are many times where they focus so much on the differences between men and women that perhaps they forget to say that among women there's lots of variation, and among men there's also lots of variation in terms of what they're interested in, for example, a partner and stuff like that.
Yeah. So to be fair, I think variation is one of the things that evolutionary psychologists investigate. So, for example, in personality research, you have lots of evolutionary psychologists. And in personality research, you have to kind of try to explain why are some people shy? Why are some people confident? Where does this variability come from? And can it be explained with Darwinian principles? You know, is it just all noise or random things happening with alleles, or are there just evolutionary trajectories that explain these patterns? And I think for mating, um, there's also a recognition that people are extremely different. You have different fetishes, kinks. People look for more casual sex. Some look for more committed relationships. So they've been building scales, you know, like sociosexuality, orientation, things like that. So I don't want to say that they kind of put this idea aside. Like they know there's huge variability in the data and they do try to explain it. It's just incredibly hard and messy. It's just really difficult to explain, you know, why some people like licking feet and why some people like cross-dressing and why some people just are not interested in sex altogether. You know, this is just very difficult topic. So they do tend to simplify and generalize and talk about averages.
Mhm.
I think in their popularization endeavors, they do remind that I'm just talking about average difference here. It means that there can be overlap. I'm not saying all women are like this, all men are like this. But I do think that in the scientific literature itself, in the papers, all those caveats, all those precautions, they're kind of thrown away. So you find them in books, you find them in textbooks, but when you're talking to other evolutionary psychologists, it's like we know we're talking about averages. We know I'm not saying all women are like this. We know what an effect size is, what a correlation is. But what they don't really know is that lay people, you know, manosphere people, can access these papers today. You know, they know Sci-Hub, they know Google Scholar. So it's not as if when you're writing a science paper, just as was the case 30 years ago, you're only writing to your colleagues in your academic, very niche branch. Now you're also kind of writing to the whole world. And, you know, those papers, they can end up on Twitter, they can end up on Reddit. And it's been seen with alt-right movements, white supremacist movements that have those journal clubs when they kind of scour the new research in population genetics and everything that they can find to support their race science, pseudoscience, they will find. So researchers now kind of have this new responsibility that maybe even in their papers, they need to be more careful about restating those precautions, you know, about variability, effect sizes, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, many evolutionary psychologists probably are not even aware that people from the manosphere are misusing their research or presenting it or making specific claims about it that they do not agree with, right? I mean,
So I've also been running a survey on that, you know, asking
okay.
them if they were aware. It was a
Yeah.
small survey. I only, you know, there are very few academics in the first place. So I think there
Okay.
were around 50 respondents.
Mhm.
Um, a lot of them had, I think maybe 20% of my respondents, like 10 out of 50, had seen their research personally appropriated, you know, for politics in some sort of another on social media. So lots of them are aware. They tell me anecdotally that when their students tell them that when they start watching evolutionary psychology on the internet, maybe it can start with your podcast, but it can end with, you know, manosphere stuff, for
Yeah.
example.
Mhm.
So there seems to be a pipeline there. And there have been articles and discussions among the evolutionary psychology community more recently. Plus, I've been sharing my research for the past years in their journals and their conferences. So I kind of come to these conferences and tell to these people, hey, here is what lay people are doing on the internet with your research. You know, here's their attitudes, is how well they understand it. Here are the biases. So I do think that nowadays it's quite well known in the evolutionary psychology community, and they can't really say that they are not aware of what's going on. You
Mhm.
know.
Yeah, I mentioned that as a possibility just because just recently Daniel Conroy Beam, an evolutionary psychology researcher, I mean, he wrote an article. I'm not sure where it is published, but he
And
wrote an
Boston Globe.
article basically, yeah, exactly, where he basically talks about how he wasn't aware of all that some people in the manosphere were misappropriating his own research and making claims that are completely different from what he was studying there. I mean, I'm going to interview him actually early next year, and we can get a little bit more into that. But there are at least a few people that are probably not aware of it.
Yeah, but see, now he is aware and he's writing articles
Yeah.
about it. And
Yeah.
I think I contributed to that. He because I know him and he said he credited me for kind of opening his eyes to the entire thing. But to be fair, the first time I reached out to him to tell him about my research, he said, "Oh, I've been waiting for this for years." So like they know that there are some, men's rights, anti-feminist people who do use their research. They also know that some academics are probably sympathetic to those ideas as well in the field. And so that's kind of a political, ideological warfare that's also going on inside this branch of academia, if you will. But I don't
Mhm.
think anyone is unaware these days, mostly because also the anthropologists, the geneticists, they've had this reckoning already 5, 6 years ago. There was the Buffalo shootings in New York, where the killer actually posted graphs from their journals, their science. And so they've been reflecting a lot on how come our discipline is so loved by racists and white supremacists? And that's kind of the same reckoning that's going on with EP. How come anti-feminists, how come, misogynists like our discipline so much? Isn't there something wrong there? And I think my goal here is just to document this, contribute to the debate. I'm not saying I have easy solutions. The
Yeah.
research is fascinating. I'm sure we'll talk about that afterwards. It
Mhm.
I don't even want people not to look at evolutionary psychology. I love evolutionary psychology. So what's my recommendation here? It's very difficult. But I do think the reckoning has been starting to come for evolutionary psychologists. And
Mhm.
another driving factor there is two other guys. Mike and Murphy has a evolutionary science podcast, if I can name your competitors. And
Oh,
so
of
he has
course.
been kind of engaging and debunking with Manosphere people online because he's on social media a lot. So he would find those people coming over and over again. And there's Date Psychology, Date Psych. He has a Twitter where he shares, kind of evolutionary inspired sex and dating research. And
Mhm.
he has been engaging with the Manosphere quite a lot on social media. So I think these guys are doing tremendous work. And they are also trying to kind of sensitize all the research community about these issues.
Right. So, I mean, just before we get into the last part of our conversation, in which I would like to ask you about probably some of the ways we could deal with the misuse of evolutionary psychology and other evolutionary sciences in the manosphere, let me just ask you about some other aspects of society, gender, and stuff like that that we haven't touched on earlier that we also see a lot in the manosphere. So, when it comes to gender roles specifically and what they understand as being feminine or masculinity and femininity, what are perhaps some of the most common claims that you see in the manosphere?
So once again, there's a lot of variability
Hmm.
because I would say there are two strands that are completely opposed, but you also find them cohabit quite easily in the manosphere.
Yeah.
Some of the earlier men's rights people in the 1970s, they came from a movement which was called men's liberation. And this was a ally of feminism. And these guys were saying, hey, the women are redefining their gender role. They are want to enter the workforce, politics, business. That's great. Why don't we do the same? Why don't we take more time to spend with our kids? Why don't we stop working 50 hours a week? Why do we don't we talk more about our emotions, be less homophobic? So this was a very woke movement for the time, and they were basically trying to deconstruct masculinity. And some of these people have remained, some of these ideas have remained. So inside the men's rights movement, they are also very suspicious of what they call tradcons, traditional conservatives, because they think this is also oppressive to men. They think having you wake up every day to put bread on the table, to be the provider of your family, having to be, cut off, shut down your emotions, not being able to open your frailness, vulnerabilities. They all think these are the negative aspects of masculinity. So you find those people in the manosphere, but in the red pill community, you also find those who say you need to be independent, self-sufficient, you need to be lean, you need to be muscular, just be an alpha man and everything will go your way. So it's hard to generalize about what you find in terms of ideology in general. But if I had to take one example that's going to interest us because of the evolutionary science that they put behind it, they are very fond about this idea of male disposability. So they do think that because, as I explained, wombs and eggs are a limiting factor in mammal reproduction, and you find plenty of sperm and plenty of males to provide it. Nature has evolved, like species have evolved, at least humans, in such a way that males are seen as disposable. Males are not really biologically valuable. So that's their argument. And then they will write entire books. Well, they find examples from our society to say that this is such a broad term. What is disposable? You can explain many things with it. So men are sent off to die in war. Men are more victims of suicide. Men tend to suffer more homelessness. They tend to die younger. They die from drugs more. These are all very interesting social issues. And I'm not saying we shouldn't look at why men do these things more. It's very important to address them, of course. But this is all to feed their idea of male disposability. You know, males, we are kind of nature's experiments. We are just there to provide our sperm, but the female dominates. So very interestingly, they have a vision of biology. It's not the male supremacist 18th, 19th century vision that you would think about. It's kind of a reverse of that because remember, they think they are oppressed. They think that male contemporary society is hostile to men. So they find in the biology a model that can completely explain that by saying, yeah, we've always been this way, you know, we have been the cannon fodders. We are the disposable men. Now, the problem with that is that the evolutionary reasoning is completely spurious. You know, Darwin himself wondered, why are there so many males? We don't need 50% of males. We could just have one lucky male for 10 females, and there would be more peace, less competition, and he could inseminate all of them, and the species would perpetuate. However, we know that natural selection does not operate at the level of what is good for the entire species. You know, organisms just kind of fight in this struggle of natural selection to maximize their own fitness. And so males over history, even though there could be less males for the good of a species, they've remained. They've fought, they've had their competition, their natural selection, their dimorphism and testosterone, etc. And so the problem with the theory of male disposability that's very popular in the manosphere, and they use it a lot to talk about gender roles, as a man, you're expected anyways, you're disposable, you're nothing to your wife or to your kids, you're just a cog in the machine. The problem is that the evolutionary model is not the best to justify this, And since the 1930s, there was a geneticist named Ronald Fisher, and he kind of explained why we have more or less 50-50% of males and females, this stable sex ratio in most species. And his argument was a thought experiment. Imagine you have a species with 90% females, 10% males. This would mean that the expected reproductive success of a son is 9 times higher than that of a daughter, which means that alleles that would kind of twist your sex ratio of the parents towards having more male kids would be selected because a son is a huge boon in terms of offspring and fitness, which means that we would kind of naturally have a rebalancing of the sex ratio until it's kind of what we observe in most species. I mean, we know sex ratios are variable. In humans, we know there are slightly more male babies born than female babies, but let's say it's more or less across, mammals, rather stable, and we have good explanations for that. And so it shows that the male disposability argument does not really hold water, but it's very, very popular to discuss society. And that's one of the main justifications for their feeling of, oppression and being like, yeah, basically useless and not looked after by society, which is a thing that I think should be addressed because, it's a valid concern and it's also potentially dangerous for the entire society. So
And what about claims about supposed alpha males? What do they tend to say about that in the manosphere?
So I think in the manosphere, being alpha, being an alpha man has um, two or three implications, or there are three elements of the definition. There's a physical one, you have to be muscular, lean, fit. There's also the idea that you're independent, you're self-sufficient, you're driven by, projects. You do your own thing. You don't owe anything to anyone else. And the third one, which is kind of linked, would be you don't get in committed relationships. You kind of are too mm, withdrawn, distant, cocky. You pretend that women don't have an influence or power on you. So you are this, I don't know, John Wayne, Harrison Ford type figure. The issue
Yeah.
with that is manifold. Firstly, you don't find the alpha male term in human research literature a lot. Even for other animals, it's not very popular. It was coined for wolves in the 1940s, but it's not even used for wolves anymore because it only works for wolves in captivity, where there are hierarchies of alpha males. But it's used for other primates, for example. So in primate societies where there's a dominance hierarchy, you will hear of the alpha male, but there's also always an alpha female. That's something that you never see in the manosphere. That's a classic. They kind of honed in on the alpha male trope because it fits, former images of masculinity, but there's nothing about the alpha female trope. In 1980s, Franz de Waal, so famous primatologist, wrote his book Chimpanzee Politics, and it was a hit in Wall Street, in Washington, D.C. The right wing Republican representative Newt Gingrich told all his other, Senate, House of the Representative mates, you should read that book. So alpha male kind of became its own concept in the corporate world, in kind of right wing self help spheres. And interestingly, it's percolated also in the manosphere, seduction techniques. And I think what's really flawed in their understanding they have of it is that it's this independent, aloof type of thing. We're a social species. So, of course, we have hierarchies in humans, and we can look at other primates with dominance hierarchies to kind of understand what's going on in our species, even though it's more complicated here. But we are a social species. So, an alpha male doesn't have to be necessarily aggressive. He doesn't have to be necessarily, and he can't be solitary and independent. That's the thing. In a social species, all leaders tend to be connected. They tend to know how to use humor, flattery, coalitions, alliances. They solve issues for others. They might be generous. So the idea is not so much with, there are two issues. They use this concept of alpha male, which has no real scientific relevance and validity in humans, and it's not really used by psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists to talk about human society in the first place. So we don't really know what it is, what it predicts. It's not a good scientific theory. But also, even if you look at other animals where we use it, we just use it as a label for top in the hierarchy. But the features that make another primate top of the hierarchy are clearly not necessarily the ones that the manosphere, dating coaches tell you to mimic or imitate in humans. They tell you to be some sort of asshole, frankly. And if you're an asshole, you're not gonna remain in power for a very long time. So in primate societies, you see alpha males that are much more politically savvy and actually more benevolent than anything you can find in the manosphere. And my own personal analysis and issue with that, what I found is that this is such a broad concept, and I've seen it with my eyes, in analyzing hundreds and thousands of pages of Manosphere content. Everything can be construed as alpha. So they use it as an adjective. They'll say, "Oh, this is so alpha, bro," anything if you put the right twist on it, oh, I lied to her, oh, that's alpha, you didn't let her penetrate your thoughts, or I told her the truth, oh, that's alpha, you're not afraid of owning up the truth. It's just a concept that's kind of devoid of any meaning, and that's really blurry, and then it can hence be used to, yeah, to mean anything. So I think it's kind of pointless.
Yeah, and I guess that when it comes to alpha males and also gender roles more broadly, we also hear it's very common for us to hear in the manosphere people saying, particularly the ones, of course, who get some money out of this, they make them making claims about how exaggerated claims about how if you want a girl, if you want a wife or something like that, you have to go to the gym, you have to have a six-figure salary, you have to have fancy cars, fancy clothes, fancy watches, and stuff like that. So I mean, they are exaggerating what women like, and even some of those things perhaps not even apply to a vast majority of them, but also I guess that by exaggerating they're also putting even more pressure on the sorts of vulnerable men that tend to follow them.
Yeah. So there's a hard balance to find. The red pillars, they are against what they call the blue pill. And the blue pill, they think, is the kind of romantic vision of love and relationship that you are fed when you're a kid. Eventually, someone will love you. You will find someone who likes you for who you are. Just be yourself. And your mom tells you that you're the most beautiful, wonderful son in the world. And they say that's how most men, young kids, boys are brought up in Western society.
Mhm.
But this is all lies because when you look at studies, you do see that, of course, there are thousands of factors that do have predictive power, that do have an influence on mate choice. So we know about height, we know about confidence, humor, prowess, being socially connected, all the things that is also part of our folk wisdom that we don't all have equal chances in the game of, relationships and sex. And so the red pillars, what they kind of say is that they use that caricature version of the blue pill that they think everyone is being fed, and they say we are the realists. We offer the hard truths. We are going to tell you the science of how you need to do to succeed, and it's a tough world, and you're going to lose all your illusions, and you can shed those blue pill beliefs. You can't be just yourself. It's not going to work. You have to go to the gym. Blah blah blah. And the thing is, those are two extreme caricatures, and as often the truth is just somewhere on a huge spectrum in the middle. Obviously, if you never shower and you never go to talk to anyone and you're rude as hell, you're never going to find a girlfriend. So the blue pill myth, just be yourself, and it will eventually work out, is plain wrong, and a lot of incels have found it for themselves. So they cater to these other narratives, which are extremely extreme, which are equally extreme, and that yeah, they overemphasize the importance of a few selected traits and factors in explaining extremely complex phenomena. And they are really really bent on generalizations. So they have this acronym in the red pill which is called AWOLT. It means all women are like that. So we were talking about variability, and we know, I mean, we've all seen women who go out with all different types of men, and we've seen huge age gaps in either directions. I mean, if there's one area where you find all potential arrangements and things, that's sex and relationships. So we know that all women are not like anything, but still there's this, gross generalizations, um, which I think can be useful to some young men. I mean, I think pickup artists in the 2000s, if they tell someone, you need to build confidence, you need to kind of go out there and meet people, get a social circle, and you'll eventually meet girls. Obviously, that's a better discourse to be hearing, and even than just lay down and rot, which is what the incels tell these young men now. It's over, it's doomed. So what do they have left? Video games, porn, suicides, mass shootings is just very bleak as well. So I'm saying, some of the self-help motivational narratives can have a positive effect on some young men's trajectories. And for sure, someone telling you, here are basic things that women like, confidence, blah, 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 probably can't hurt. The thing is, how much do you exaggerate this?
Yeah.
And what's the vision of female nature that you have behind that? Is it just neutral, dispassionate, scientific? Here are the preferences of men and women, here they come from. Or is it driven by, this misogynistic biases and tropes, like they are all like this, she will never like you for who you are, she's always looking for another. We don't know, there's much more variability. And the
Yeah.
very interesting thing that I noticed on incel forums is that back when they were on Reddit, now they've all been banned, you had a lot of normies coming, so people from outside communities, and the women would say, actually, I'm not like this. You describe someone, but that's not how I feel. My boyfriend is autistic, or I don't discriminate men based on their height or something. And they would never believe, they would never accept these testimonies by women who are kind of trying to help them. Like, you do have a chance, my boyfriend is not a Chad and I love him dearly. And they kept on saying, that's wrong, that's just what you say, but what are your revealed preferences? Stated preferences are easy. So they have kind of this double standard for skepticism. If there's something that feeds your worldview, they can accept the most ridiculous piece of evidence to show that it proves, validates their vision of female nature, which is very dark. But then if you have examples in the other direction, they are going to be the most, hardened skeptics, and they won't believe it, unfortunately. So that's kind of the opposite of the open mind you need for scientific inquiry, where
Yeah.
you're ready to accept evidence for all positions, basically.
Yeah. And so, just as a last topic here, what would you say, perhaps, since you've been studying and looking into these manosphere communities and so on, what would you say, perhaps, would be some of the best ways to try to fight back against the misappropriation of evolutionary science and even other kinds of science that they do there?
So that's obviously the question that I'm being asked a lot because I study
Yeah.
this, and people come and they say, so what's the solution? What should we do? It's hard. It's hard because that's a great science. I don't want to censor evolutionary psychology. Most people do genuinely good work and they are motivated by looking for the truth. And I don't want to come up as some sort of, censor for the entire field. I love it. I want to contribute to the field. On the other hand, we can't accept the idea that we have no responsibility. Those people do things with our research. I can never prevent it. So why should I do anything about it? And it's true that it's very hard to prevent. My friend Macken, who's the science podcaster, he's gone and he's debated pundits from the Manosphere live. And he said at the end, I don't feel like I accomplished anything. I feel like they've kind of became more radical, more entrenched in their position. It's just not working. So it's really tough work. I think at least if the field makes sure that it communicates clearly, that the results are solid, that you mention the variability, the uncertainties, that you're cautious about generalization, that you also mention, the effect sizes and things like that. There's a lot you can do to kind of try to shield yourself from appropriation by politicized factions. And at least if it doesn't work, maybe it can shield the field from criticisms from other branches of academia, because that's a PR disaster. EP is already controversial, and you do have communities that some of them do mass shootings, for example. Sometimes, periodically, you have one incel that commits acts of massive violence. You don't want those people quoting your science. You don't want those people, you don't want to be associated with them, even in terms of the politics of academia. So first, I think there are incentives and justifications for evolutionary scientists to take this seriously. Then there's the question of what they can do. And then it becomes really hard because, as I said, the content is open, it's on the internet, it's accessible, and we like that. And I'm not even sure sometimes that there's a solution where you can really prevent someone with different values from having a different conclusion. So look, for example, scientific studies, they look at links between variables, right? They tell you, I looked at this little bit of nature or society, and here is, I think, if you pull this lever, this happens. This is what happens. And that's it. They are descriptive. Now, they might end their paper by saying, well, maybe we can use this lever to, accomplish that goal. But nothing prevents someone with completely different values to say, oh, I'm going to use this lever to accomplish this goal. And even if a scientist was telling people, hey, look, I've studied women's mate preferences, here's what would make them tick. Please don't use this to seduce women, or please don't use this for that. I mean, no one believes people would actually believe that. So what do we do as social scientists if we find things where, this link between variables can be used for all kinds of ends? It's a really difficult question. So I've seen incels, for example, being fascinated with research on endocrine disrupting chemicals. They do think that there's some sort of global homosexual Jewish conspiracy that's poisoning the water as we speak, and trying to make men into more feminized versions of men. And it's true that if you look at the research, they are not Jewish conspiracies, but endocrine disrupting chemicals in our drinking water. We do find that the water is polluted. And the values of most scientists who study this is to say, we find this link, and in terms of prescriptive, so this is descriptive, and in terms of prescription, we think this means we can filter the water, we could use this technology, we can heal people. Incels just say, let's ban the contraceptives. Let's ban the contraceptive pill because that's where a lot of the chemicals, the estrogens, come from. And from their own point of view, if you don't have sex and if you hate women, why should you care that people pollute your drinking water with your contraceptive pills? So once again, they have very different values. So they have their different interpretation of the research. But what can the researchers do about it? I don't think they can do much. So when I'm being asked for easy fixes, I think it's really hard because these are politics. And I mean, if I could use my magic wand and kind of fix, hatred and division between communities and nations in politics, I would do it. But the thing is,
Yeah.
the manosphere is also anchored to the broader political climate
Yeah.
of, culture wars online, polarized politics in the US. So it's been drifting more and more to the right. In Europe here as well, you find in the European manosphere, so Spanish, Italian, French, you find much more of the anti-immigration, far right positions that are spreading politically across Europe from Eastern, Northern, Southern Europe. And the manosphere is just part of that. I mean, it's somewhere in that cultural landscape. So I would be very presumptuous if I thought that I myself could find solutions, to kind of hundreds of thousands or millions of people holding beliefs that I don't agree with or that I find distasteful. So I think it's really hard. That's political struggle. That's ideological battle, which is not really my industry as a researcher. And maybe my final take on that would be it's really hard to correct people's opinions and beliefs. And if we are to be a liberal, tolerant society, our goal is also to be, that's one of the classics of liberalism, people do their thing. People think what they want. They have their own religion. They have their own beliefs. I don't mind. So at the end of the day, if you have red pill men and red pill women who want to be in traditional marriages and they consent to the thing and the woman likes, making sandwiches for her husband, hey, I think that's a pity. That's not how I want to run my life. But that's also not the worst in a tolerant, open society. So maybe what we should focus on is the overtly antisocial, um, dangerous, violent consequences, manifestations of manosphere ideology. I'm not sure I can ever be able to gut out, tradition views about traditional gender roles and masculinity. Those go back for millennia. However, if we make sure that we prevent the more radicalized members from committing terror attacks, we protect, people from cyber harassment, because if you're a feminist and you speak out on some of these issues, you're going to receive reams of cyber harassment. Myself, as a manosphere researcher, I've had to make sure to take precautions along the way and things like that. So if we actually can make sure that, these things are mitigated, and then hopefully some content producers, some politicians can inspire young men and just bring forward new models of masculinity and answer men about their anxieties about current society, because there are anxieties that are completely legitimate that drive people to the manosphere. Young men seem to be more likely to fall prey to, video game addictions, pornography addictions. They are doing less well than girls at school, and the gap is widening. They are enrolling less in college. So there's definitely a lot of space to occupy for politics in those male issues, trying to tell men, about what their role and their identity should be as men, as even biological males. I love biology, but I wish it was done by other people than those in the manosphere. And unfortunately, there's lots of work to do on these issues. And at the moment, lots of young men are catering towards TikTok or YouTube content that just tells them how to be those assholes, basically. But I wouldn't know of a solution to that. I think it would come from politics, from deep changes, and I think this disgruntlement of segments of the male population also has deep economic roots. The Western countries have been kind of plateauing or declining, not declining, but their economies, are not booming like they used to be in the post-World War II era. So for a lot of men today, you're not necessarily going to do as well as your parents. You're not going to be able to buy a house in a big city because the real estate prices, blah, blah, blah. Those are all super deep political economic issues, and I think they are driving forces in the manosphere as well. So my answer would be it's complicated, and I don't have any, magic solution.
Yeah, but great. I think that's a very good final message for us to end the interview on. And Louis, if people are interested in learning more about you and your work, where can they find you on the internet?
You can find my publications on Google Scholar, and then I don't know when the podcast will be out, but I am writing up the final stages of my PhD dissertation. So if you're more interested about this, I wrote 400 pages of Manosphere history, Manosphere sociology, and you will have a complete breakdown of my analysis where I compare the scientific state of the art, the scientific literature, and I try to be really fair and even-handed to what people actually say in the Manosphere. And so if yourself, some of your listeners are, adjacent or interested, involved in the manosphere, I'm trying to examine your beliefs and tropes and compare them with what actual evolutionary science says. And I hope it can, lead you to reconsider some positions or to nuance some of them. That would be I would be very proud if my research can accomplish that.
Great. So perhaps we have to schedule a second interview when your dissertation is finished. So to talk about all of the other information you will probably have there. So thank you so much for doing this. It's been a very fun and informative conversation. So.
Thanks for having me, Ricardo.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.